Welcome to the THOR Table of Knowledge podcast, where we dive deep into the groundbreaking world of trauma care, hemostasis, and oxygenation research. A special thank you to our sponsor, Velico, for their support. Velico is revolutionizing trauma care with their innovative frontline ODP spray-dried plasma system, with the goal of empowering blood centers worldwide to produce dried plasma for transfusions.
Good afternoon. My name is Andre Kapp. I'm here today with my colleagues, Maggie Neal, trauma surgeon and professor of surgery at the University of Pittsburgh, and Ethan Miles, former U.S. Army Ranger and regimental surgeon for the 75th Ranger Regiment, and now Chief Medical Officer, North American Rescue. We're going to talk about change management, implementation of new clinical science, and specifically about tranexamic acid in whole blood, and how military and civilian researchers came together to drive science to improve implementation and improve trauma care. Thanks very much for joining me, gentlemen. Let's start with you, Mackie. Let's talk a little bit about tranexamic acid. So the study that launched this product in the trauma world was this CRASH-2 trial published in Lancet in 2010. Now, it's 14 years ago. Tranexamic acid use in the United States was sort of slow to start. This was a huge study of 20,000 patients randomized all over the world. I think there were like 270-something hospitals in 40-something countries. Just a tremendously large study run out of the UK, but not actually including U.S. trauma centers. And so uptake was a little bit hesitant. Why don't you start us off by talking a little bit about how, in the civilian world, we viewed tranexamic acid in that initial post-2010 period, how we rolled it out?
Yeah, thanks, Andre, and it's great to be here and fun to share the table and a beer and talk about this. So, first off, I would say I think in some ways the slow uptake is good science, because it's really people dissecting a study and understanding whether it was relevant to their patient population. And so, although we might cast it in a bit of a negative light that it took so long for this to become part of practice, there is sort of a mandatory period of dissection of the science. But specifically about TXA, I'll tell you a little bit about my perspective in understanding when to use it. So CRASH-2 comes out, and I think the first question that everybody had was, is this really relevant to my patient population? As you suggest, unique and heterogeneous design, which has benefits to it, but a question of, was this really the patients that, we're seeing? So I think that was a big upfront, concern that came along with that. But then what was really interesting was, as there were supportive studies, including MATTERS, that came out from military experience and starting to see civilian experience, there was this suggestion, and particularly in some non-randomized studies, of a signal towards harm that was associated with thrombosis. And that was really one of the early things that I think people latched onto, was the possibility that, hey, maybe this is a little too good to be true, right? It's not a panacea, and I think inherently sometimes as scientists and surgeons, we're skeptics. And so the skeptics latched onto the fact that in some of the observational data, to which my hypocrisy knows no bounds, I contributed, right? That there was potentially a signal towards harm. And, it's really remarkable that some of these small observational studies of maybe cumulatively dozens or a couple hundred patients put the brakes on implementation of a randomized trial with 20,000 trauma patients.
So, Ethan, Mackie mentioned that the MATTERS study, which for the audience, that was an observational study of U.S. and allied casualties, data predominantly drawn from the DoD trauma registry, and mostly patients treated in Afghanistan. Tell me a little bit about how tranexamic acid came into the U.S. military use, and how all these different dueling studies affected your own implementation of the product.
Yeah, so great question. I think
this kind of goes to a discussion that we were having earlier on implementation of evidence-based medicine. So kind of backing up a little bit, at least at Ranger Regiment, we knew we were doing a great job at eliminating preventable death, thanks to Coatwell's article, right? We're doing a great job on extremity hemorrhage, great job on airways, tension pneumo, right? We're crushing it with that, right? But what we were seeing is every single rotation, really since kind of GWAT kicked off, is that we're taking casualties, right? And we're still losing guys to non-compressible torso damage, right? And so it's one thing to kind of sit there and twiddle your thumbs and hem and haw and hope for the next best study. It's a little different story when you're going down range, right? And you're sending guys down range. There's a lot of urgency. And so you don't necessarily have the luxury of sitting back and saying, well, let's wait until we find the perfect trial that's going to fit us. And so I think there's definitely with us, there was a bias towards early adoption, right? We're losing people. There's an urgency. And so what can we do to possibly help that out? And so what we did is really kind of look at the data and say, you know what, this makes sense, right? And it wasn't us in an isolated vacuum. It was us talking with THOR. It was us talking with the greater community, with the ISR, with the JTS, and saying, hey, I think this really makes sense for our population. You mentioned the harm in it. You're already seeing a lot of thrombotic events that were happening post-casualty status, right, as they went through the evacuation chain. And so not to just ignore that, but hey, maybe this can help get after some of those potentially survivable casualties. So I think that's really kind of how we looked at it, is there's a need to do something about it. And to me, and to us collectively, the evidence was strong enough to say, hey, let's give it a shot. We think this could help.
And to your earlier point, Mackie, we're doing good science here, right? In the sense that we have imperfect data, but we're trying to meet these urgent demands, right? So we gathered more data, right? And part of that ultimately fed the Matters study. Now, there's some interesting things about how Crash 2 implemented tranexamic acid that have direct relevance to this sort of military-civilian discussion we're having. Namely that, and for all the medics in the audience who enjoy THOR podcasts and other pre-hospital providers, I think this is key. Practicality matters, right? So the crash investigators modeled their intervention on a cardiac surgery administration, regimen of 10 minutes of slow IV infusion followed by an 8-hour infusion, like slow IV push with an 8-hour infusion. How'd that work out with the Rangers, Ethan?
Ranger medics are capable of anything they put their mind to. However, if you look at what's going on in a dynamic environment, you have to take best practices in a hospital or recommended ways of doing things and adapt them to where you're practicing medicine, right? So it's very impractical to treat non-compressible torso hemorrhage in a firefight and say, I'm going to mix up TXA. I'm going to put it in a bag, and then I'm going to hang this bag, all while you're in a firefight, you're trying to move the casualty, you're doing a dozen other things to get them going. So, if we did train that. We did practice that of like, okay, draw it, you got to do it over 10, because it was, man, if you go any faster than 10 minutes, they're going to get hypotensive and you're going to kill your patient from this drug. And so we saw very early on that the impracticalities of that. And so that's when, a lot of discussion with you, a lot of discussion with the THOR group of, hey, do we really have to do it this way? Or are we going to be okay if we do it another way? And I remember talking to Elon Glasper, and he's like, we've been pushing it for a while. He's like, just go, right? And so we started incrementally moving to where we finally got to. The next was, all right, let's draw it up in a syringe. Let's do a slow push. Slow push, what's that mean, right?
Right.
Maybe over a couple minutes, maybe over a minute. Yeah, just kind of give little bumps as you go. That's a little bit more practical because you can have a syringe near the patient and kind of give bumps as you go. And so that was a little bit more practical. And then we just kept migrating as we saw more and more evidence, talked to more and more anesthesiologists and people that were pushing it on a regular basis, especially, European partners, where it eventually migrated into one of my PAs, I think it was Mike Broussard, called me and was like, hey, we're just going to start the IO and then we'll flush the IO with the TXA and then send blood right behind it. And I'll never forget that, because I'm telling people, I'm like, hey, we're to the point now where we have the, I guess, misfortune, we have the fortune of knowing exactly when the injury occurs, right? Because we're in that firefight with them. We're on the ground with them. So we know exactly when it happens. And so, our team of medics was able to get, from the time of injury, within a couple of minutes, they've got IO access, they've got their TXA on board, and they're already giving blood. And I'm like within a few minutes, and people just couldn't believe that we were doing it that quickly. So timing is key, and I want to bring this together with Mackie on that. So the original crash studies showed that the benefit from tranexamic acid really occurs when patients get it within the first hour after injury, right? And in every subsequent randomized trial with TXA, we've seen the same thing. Maternal hemorrhage, GI bleed, whatever, it's give it within the first hour, immediately if possible, like your medics do. One of the things that we did was an audit of patients that we thought met, criteria for remote damage control resuscitation. We found out that something like less than 7% of those patients actually received TXA because the cumbersome crash protocol was just like not feasible in the field, right? So again, data driven. Now, in the civilian hospital environment, I imagine that this might have been an issue with things like patient transfer or even documentation. Like, did they get it early? Did they get it pre-hospital? Did they get it at the other hospital? Should we give it again? Was that an issue so much, or what?
Yeah, well, what I would say, Andre, and I think this is just such a great example of one of the things that THOR has done exceptionally well, and that our culture of a community partnership between military and civilian medicine, this really highlights what a success story it could be. Because this evolution of pragmatism, right? What can I actually do in the field? How can we adapt, and how can we be responsive? Then makes its way back to civilian medicine and starts to become part of the design of subsequent trials, right? And so what we have learned, as you suggest, when we dissect the data in retrospect, that earlier is better, is now the evolution of everything we study in trauma care and civilian world is, once we show in the hospital that it works, that you move it to a pre-hospital setting. And so what we started to see was maybe the 1 gram and slow wasn't the answer, but when you look at the STAMP trial, which was pre-hospital air medical TXA at civilian centers, the TXA for TBI trial, the signal to benefit in all of those is early and 2 gram dosing. So we learned from that implementation in the battlefield that that's the way that we should be studying it. So to specifically answer your question, I think that period of uptake is when we were still a little conflicted about the data and interpreting it from crash. And another part of that was interpreting a protocol that was designed based on cardiac surgery data and applying it to trauma. What happened in those years in between was this flood of great data that came in that said, yeah, that signal was real. It is safe. There is no thrombotic risk. Let me repeat that again. There is no thrombotic risk. And now we're going to evolve to really make it practical, and we're going to ask trauma-specific questions. And that's where we got the data from, STAMP, TXA for TBI, now the patch trial from Australia, which have a remarkable degree of consistency.
Right. And speaking of which, it's come full circle because the Committee on Tactical Combat Casualty Care has adopted the 2 gram IV push up front. So this is really a great symbiosis, as you're saying, of military-civilian partnership to drive us towards best practice, right?
So moving on from TXA, the next big thing was whole blood, right? And Ethan, I fondly remember a THOR meeting back in 2013, I believe it was, where we did the proverbial map this out over a cocktail napkin. But tell us a little bit about, you brought TXA on board, you were seeing some progress with that, but there was still fruit to be gathered and casualties to be saved. So what led up to the world famous Rolo program?
Yeah, so I think for a little bit of background, again, it kind of goes back to, we had the urgency of every rotation we're taking casualties. So there was a real sense of urgency to progress medicine on the battlefield at the point of injury, try to bring more Rangers home, right? And so at that time, we already had freeze-dried plasma, but it was the French freeze-dried plasma, and we're carrying bottles around, and you got to do is swirl it for a while and everything. So less than French wine. Yes, like a fine French wine, right?
Useful product. We're not laughing.
No, very useful.
Save some Ranger lives.
Absolutely. But it just, there's got to be a better way to do this, right? And then Andy Fisher and I, my good buddy, we came over. He was regimental PA at the time, or maybe STB PA, and then we came over to the THOR. And lo and behold, there's this meeting about full blood. And even before I got to THOR, I got picked up from the airport, and we went right to one of the air ambulance places, and they're giving a guy training his own whole blood through a sternal IO that they placed on through a fast one. I was like, whoa, what are we in for? This is pretty awesome, right? So we do this conference, and here we're talking about whole blood. Gare's talking about whole blood and what their plan is. Now I think at that time they were shipping it over to Afghanistan and back, and so I was like, hey, we're talking about this. We got to do this. So we sit at the table of knowledge with several of the THOR leads, and man, I think it was about 3 o'clock, 4 in the morning before we got to bed. And I remember the next morning,
because Sean Kane, Kevin Ward,
yep,
and Andy,
yep,
right,
yep. And so the next morning, took a picture of the napkin, and I texted you, and I'm like, dude, I think this makes sense. Like, we have to actually do an Olo titer blood program at Ranger Regiment. So came back, Andy and I worked hard on getting that one going. I think it was the next year, we started getting hung up on what's a low titer, because there wasn't an established one, at least in the U.S., certainly not in the DOD.
That's since World War II.
Yeah.
Right.
And we kind of went back and said, maybe we just use that, right?
Right.
I remember, the THOR meeting where I'm like, give me a number, right? Nobody wanted to give me a number. What does low titer mean? Is it 128? Is it 256? Or what is it? Give me a number. I got people dying overseas. I need a number, damn it. I'm going back home to my Rangers, right?
Okay.
And so I think, you and a few others finally were like, all right, what's the number? And we're like, 256 sounds about right. So, anyway, we came back, kind of wrote that paper and decided, hey, this is how we're going to do the Rolo program. And then, a lot of political dancing with some people that tried to block the program. And then obviously your backing and a lot of others, whenever they tell me you can't do that, you're going to kill someone, you can't do blood transfusions, I'd say, hey, why don't you call up Andre Cap? And they'd be like, wait. Andre's behind this? Like, yeah. Okay, how can we help? Good idea.
Right.
So I think it was about a year later we started titer testing people. So we got titer testing going. I remember January I went over to Afghanistan, and we had the titer testing going, and Andy came over and he was kind of high-fiving with me, and so we talked about it. He's like, all right, I'm staying on for a month. I think we need to pre-draw it, and we need to really have it quickly, right? Because once someone gets shot, now we're going to go draw. That's going to take a while, right?
I think this was like 2016 by this point.
Yeah, 2016. Yeah. Yep. And so, because that's all the famous pictures that Andy took where you ever see the low titer blood, it's like Bagram, Afghanistan, like 2016. So Andy said, hey, we got guys in the jock, and they're not going out on target, and they're low titer. We know this already. We're going to pull their blood. Blood detachment was a little skeptical of that, but
in good Ranger fashion. Andy's like, I don't really care. We're doing it. We'll put it in our fridge. We don't need your fridge. And then about that time, Jason Corley started getting a little involved in everything and really kind of got on board and got behind what we're doing. And they said, hey, we appreciate what you guys are doing. Let us help you, right? We'll help you draw it. We'll store it for you. You can take it out on Target. And
so that was really the launch.
Yeah.
Low Titer O.
Yep. By Armed Services Blood Program.
Yep. Now, this is all happening not completely in isolation because we had our good friends at the University of Pittsburgh, Mackie and Mark Yeaser and the whole team, implementing whole blood kind of in that same time frame and doing some good science. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So, again, taking a page a little bit out of the experience just described, there's a lot of buzz about doing this for a long time from our, relationships with the military. And all, I'll tell you, I couldn't tell you the exact history. We've never written it down. It's a shame that we didn't. Maybe someday somebody should. But I remember first conversation, I was still a surgical resident, and Alan Murdoch was an Air Force surgeon. And Alan was with us in Pittsburgh on faculty. And, he comes in and was in a meeting and he said, so what we're going to do is we're going to start giving whole blood. And I went, yeah, sure you are, right? Totally skeptical of this. But the evolution of it was amazing because you had this military perspective embedded in a civilian center. And then we've got, Mark Yeaser and the folks in transfusion medicine who were incredibly progressive, who said, okay, you guys start doing it. We'll show that it's safe. Right. And then Jason Sperry starting to design clinical trials, our group running laboratory science, and then an initiative really around implementation, safety studies towards efficacy, and then fundamental science. And, it almost became an addiction for us, right? Because we saw the benefit to our patients. And then we saw the leaps that it would take in order to really make this grow and scale. And that's been a decade-long commitment.
And I think one of the key contributions y'all made was the documentation of no hemolysis, kind of like the no thrombosis with TXA. Everybody was worried that we were going to kill people with hemolysis, and it never happened. We couldn't even detect it by labs in that great paper y'all wrote. And I think that was huge. And I just got to throw in one plug for Alan Murdoch. So he was an early THOR participant. And little known fact, he was a trauma fellow at Boston Medical Center, BU, where I was a medical student of the trauma service at the time. So I knew him way back and then reconnected with him at THOR. It was really cool.
That's awesome.
And then visits to Pitt. So anyway, great. Well, I think we are about ready to wrap this up. Any parting thoughts, gentlemen, about implementation of new clinical science, TXA, whole blood? What's next? Anything that you want to tell the audience before we finish up?
I guess I would just say, for those listening to the podcast that didn't get a chance to hear the opening to THOR today, it was an incredible discussion about leadership and driving change. And one of the messages which was hard to hear, but is so accurate and important, is that it takes time. And it is frustrating when you've got life-saving science and you want to scale and make it widespread. But there are barriers to doing that. And it is a slow, steady pressure that achieves it. And I think it takes people being very passionate and very vocal and wanting to push it quickly, but recognizing that, it takes time, it takes patience, it takes science. But these two examples, right, whole blood and TXA, are, incredible representations of the success that can happen from the process.
Absolutely. No, very well said. As Elon put it earlier today, it's step by step. That's exactly right. Parting thoughts, Ethan?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to tag on to that, we had breakfast with General McChrystal today and a great talk with him. And I think key to implementing change is also building that team, right? Which obviously he's an expert on, wrote a book about it. But that was very helpful for us, was building that team. It wasn't just Ethan Miles, like, I got an idea, I'm doing this, right? We had Kirk Conkle, we had Andy Fisher, we had like the crew, but then we also had this other team primarily through the THOR network, right?
Giants like Gare, like Don Jenkins.
Yeah, where we could go back to and go, okay, like look at the bibliography of like how much these guys have written. And
Phil's work on all of this.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, Phil's huge. And so that really kind of gives you the power then to speed up that implementation and say, kind of in Ranger fashion, right? Hey, screw it. We think it's a good idea. Think about it, and then boom, let's just go ahead. And sometimes you just got to execute and start doing it.
And gather the data, and learn and adapt and perfect it. Absolutely. Well, gentlemen, this has been a great discussion. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for joining me here. And with that, we'll conclude. And off to THOR. So, cheers.
That's a wrap for this episode of the THOR Table of Knowledge podcast. A big thank you to our sponsor, Velico, for supporting the advancement of trauma care. Their frontline ODP spray-dried plasma system is paving the way for blood centers globally to produce potentially life-saving plasma for transfusions. Check out our website, www.thornetwork.com, for more podcasts, and join us next time as we continue to explore the cutting-edge science of trauma, hemostasis, and oxygenation. Until then, stay safe and stay informed.